Mark the Hammer Delaney, Tony Russo, and Sean McCallum were Liverpool's most feared gangsters, but one by one, they were hunted down in broad daylight, executed with chilling precision, and left the city's underworld in terror. No witnesses, no arrests, and no answers, just a trail of unanswered questions and a faceless killer who seemed to strike at will. This is the story of the deadly Liverpool unsolved Gangland murders. Liverpool's streets had always carried an air of tension, a quiet undercurrent of danger that locals had learned to ignore. But in the spring of 2012, that tension erupted into fear. The city's criminal underworld was shaken to its core when 3 high-profile figures were found dead within the span of 6 months. Each of these men held considerable sway in Liverpool's organized crime scene. Yet they all met violent, unexpected ends. Their deaths weren't random. They were methodical, calculated, and unnervingly similar. People began to whisper that someone was targeting the city's most notorious figures, a silent predator moving through the gangs with lethal precision. The first victim was known for running mid-level drug operations across the north side of Liverpool. He was gunned down outside a betting shop, in broad daylight, in front of dozens of shocked pedestrians. CCTV footage captured a figure approaching him, helmet obscuring the face, and walking away calmly after the shots were fired. Despite the public nature of the murder, no one could identify the shooter, fingerprints yielded nothing, and witnesses either fled the scene or refused to cooperate. Authorities were left with more questions than answers, while the local gangs interpreted the attack as a warning. 2 months later, another killing sent further ripples through the criminal community. This time it was a nightclub security boss, a man notorious for his ruthlessness in controlling Liverpool's nightlife. He was shot while sitting in his car outside a popular venue, in an area considered one of the city's safer districts. Again, the assailant vanished without a trace. Ballistics confirmed a professional-grade weapon, unregistered and almost impossible to trace. Rumors swirled that an outside hitman had been hired to send a message. No one in the Liverpool underworld was safe. The final death in this sequence struck even closer to the heart of organized crime. A well-known smuggler, heavily involved in importing contraband into the city, was shot in his own home. The gunman fired through the kitchen window, striking the man as he leaned over a half-eaten plate of food. Neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual, and when police arrived, the crime scene was eerily quiet. The meticulous nature of the killings indicated premeditation and skill, suggesting that the perpetrator was not a typical street-level gangster, but someone trained and methodical, capable of executing a plan without leaving evidence behind. Liverpool's criminal networks began to unravel under the weight of fear. Old alliances dissolved almost overnight. Trusted associates became suspicious of one another, unsure of who might be next. Business deals stalled, and some gangs retreated from the streets entirely, unwilling to risk being seen as vulnerable. The murders created a vacuum of power, one that nobody wanted to fill for fear of being targeted themselves. The police launched an intensive investigation, yet the trail was frustratingly cold. Detectives scoured CCTV footage, interrogated potential witnesses, and monitored gang communications, but each lead ended in a dead end. It was clear that the killer had access to insider knowledge, operating with a level of sophistication that suggested more than a simple gang feud. Rumors began to circulate that information from within law enforcement might have been leaked to the perpetrator, allowing him to strike with surgical precision. Amid the tension, the city's everyday life carried on with a false sense of normality. Streets that had once felt familiar became zones of uncertainty. Business owners worried about retaliation if they were perceived as sympathetic to any faction. Ordinary citizens, hearing about these murders in the news, began to avoid certain neighborhoods and nightlife spots altogether. The fear extended beyond the criminal circles, touching every corner of Liverpool. The 3 murders shared more than method. They shared symbolism. Each victim was connected by their reputation for enforcing dominance through violence. Each death seemed to erase a particular type of power from the criminal ecosystem, creating a chilling sense of order within chaos. While the murders were public and brazen, the pattern behind them remained hidden, as if the killer was sending a message only understood by those who lived and breathed the city's underworld. By the summer of 2012, Liverpool's gangland had transformed. The city's streets, once alive with bold, audacious criminals, now echoed with caution. Fear was the new currency, and paranoia dictated every move. People whispered about a ghost, faceless, unstoppable figure who could strike without warning and disappear without trace. For the ordinary citizen, these murders were shocking tales in the newspapers. For those in the criminal underworld, they were reminders of mortality and the price of power. The question that haunted the city was simple: who could commit such precise, terrifying acts and remain invisible? The answer remained elusive, and with each passing day, the shadow of fear grew, leaving Liverpool on edge and desperate for answers that never came. As the city struggled to process the first wave of murders, investigators quickly realized that these killings were not typical gangland reprisals. The precision with which each victim had been targeted suggested a level of planning and aimed far beyond ordinary street crime. Detectives began to suspect that the killer or killers were professionals, possibly operating from outside Liverpool, someone with training in stealth, timing and execution. The idea that a local gang member could carry out 3 high-profile murders in such a short period without leaving any trace seemed almost impossible. The second chapter of the investigation revealed more disturbing patterns. All 3 victims had recently been under police surveillance for separate reasons: drug trafficking, extortion, and organized smuggling. Yet before the authorities could gather enough evidence to press charges, they were eliminated. Some officers began whispering to one another that the killer may have been working with insider knowledge from law enforcement itself. Others worried about the possibility of corruption within the force, suggesting that certain officers could have been compromised by bribes, threats, or fear. The thought that a faceless assassin could operate with such inside information only deepened the sense of paranoia. Liverpool's gangland was becoming increasingly unstable. Small-time criminals and mid-level enforcers vanished without explanation, their absence sending shockwaves through rival networks. Rumors spread that anyone who had any knowledge of the killings or who might speak to the police was being targeted. Some gangs reportedly began issuing informal death threats to members who had contacts with law enforcement, warning them to stay silent. Even those considered untouchable felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on their operations. Meanwhile, the ordinary public began to notice subtle signs of tension in neighborhoods known for criminal activity. Pubs that had once thrived on rowdy weekend crowds saw fewer visitors. Street corners were quieter, the usual banter between dealers and customers replaced by nervous glances and whispered warnings. Drivers slowed when passing certain areas, wary of being caught in crossfire or witnessing a violent act. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next headline to announce another shocking death. As the investigation continued, police analysts uncovered a strange connection between the victims. Each man had previously been involved in disputes that had escalated, but never resolved, conflicts that had left enemies with scores to settle. The first victim, the mid-level drug distributor, had narrowly escaped an attack 2 years earlier, which had been chalked up to a turf dispute. The nightclub security boss had been implicated in multiple assaults on rival staff, earning him grudges across the city. The smuggler had tangled with international criminal networks over shipments gone missing. The pattern suggested a vendetta, but one executed with chilling efficiency. The detectives also noticed a peculiar consistency in the method of murder. Public locations, daytime attacks, and precision shots seemed almost ritualistic, a signature that tied the 3 cases together more firmly than any motive could. Some analysts suggested that the killer may have been sending a message, but the intended recipient remained a mystery. It was as if the crimes were meant to communicate something to those who understood the unspoken rules of the underworld, while remaining completely opaque to outsiders. Amid this uncertainty, criminal alliances began to fracture. Trusted associates grew suspicious of one another, and the city's gangs operated more covertly than ever before. Business transactions slowed, enforcers were replaced with outsiders, and new rules were silently enforced on the streets. Fear dictated behavior. Caution became a survival skill. The killings had not only removed key figures from the criminal hierarchy, but had reshaped the entire landscape, leaving those who survived scrambling for protection, alliances, and information that might never come. Law enforcement struggled to keep up. Resources were stretched thin, as detectives juggled surveillance, intelligence gathering, and the mounting pressure of public scrutiny. The media seized on every detail, publishing photographs, alleged sightings, and eyewitness accounts, none of which led to arrests. Public interest was intense but fleeting, and many wondered if the authorities were in over their heads. The lack of leads, combined with the brazen nature of the killings, created a climate of frustration and fear within the police force itself. As Liverpool's underworld reeled from the first 3 murders, one thing became clear. The city had become the hunting ground for someone who was always one step ahead. The sophistication of the attacks, the apparent knowledge of each victim's movements, and the absence of any traceable evidence indicated a chilling level of planning and control. The mystery deepened, the danger escalated, and the question on everyone's mind, criminal, cop, and civilian alike, was the same. Who was orchestrating these murders, and who would be next? As spring turned to summer, Liverpool's criminal underworld found itself in a state of quiet chaos. The first 3 murders had left a trail of fear and uncertainty, and now smaller acts of violence began to ripple through the city. Drive-by shootings, beatings in back alleys, and arson attacks on known gang hangouts became more frequent, though none carried the same precision as the previous killings. Detectives noted that these acts were often chaotic, impulsive, and uncoordinated, suggesting they were carried out by desperate rivals attempting to reassert dominance. The city had become a powder keg, each spark threatening to ignite full-scale gang warfare. Meanwhile, investigators continued to hunt for connections between the murders, though the trail remained frustratingly cold. Ballistics, surveillance, and witness statements provided little clarity. It was as if the original killer had planned every move to ensure there would be no evidence left behind. Yet, despite this meticulous planning, small hints began to emerge. A discarded handgun found near the Mersey River contained ballistics that matched 2 of the 3 murders. The weapon was traced back to a shipment stolen from a military storage facility years earlier, a heist that had never been solved. Whoever was behind the murders had access to weapons that were untraceable, rare and deadly. The discovery of the weapon sent ripples through law enforcement. Detectives began considering the possibility that the killer had connections far beyond Liverpool. International arms dealers, black market networks, and organized crime groups with global reach were suddenly plausible suspects. The nature of the killing suggested a professional who could move without attracting attention, someone with the experience and resources to operate under the radar. As speculation grew, anonymous tips began appearing in unexpected places. Letters, emails, and even messages sent through local newspapers claimed to reveal information about the murders. One letter, delivered to the Liverpool Echo, was particularly chilling. It stated simply, "They weren't innocent, they knew why." The authenticity of the note could not be verified. Yet it fueled theories that the victims had broken some unspoken code. Perhaps they had crossed the wrong people, betrayed alliances, or failed to honor debts that could not be overlooked. Whatever the truth, the message reinforced the sense that these murders were more than random acts of violence. They were calculated lessons in fear and control. The city itself began to feel the effects of these tensions. Neighborhoods known for gang activity experienced a subtle but pervasive paranoia. Business owners became wary of engaging with known criminals, fearing that any interaction could mark them as targets. Residents who once walked freely through the streets now looked over their shoulders, especially at night. Parents warned their children about areas that were previously considered safe, and the usual hum of everyday life was replaced by whispers of danger and speculation. Amid this unrest, police received a tip from a low-level informant who claimed to have seen the helmeted killer enter a deserted warehouse after one of the murders. Authorities raided the location, but found nothing concrete. No bodies, no weapons, only traces of recent occupancy. The walls were lined with soundproof panels, and faint boot prints led to a hidden exit. It was clear that the killer had been there, but the space had been abandoned long before the police arrived. The sophistication of the setup indicated careful planning, as if the warehouse had been used as a temporary base, a place to prepare and observe without being detected. The investigation also revealed that the killings had a ripple effect on the criminal hierarchy. Rival factions, previously united against common enemies, began turning on each other. Suspicion became a constant companion, and loyalty was fragile. Informants disappeared, alliances crumbled, and even seasoned gang members felt vulnerable. The killings were no longer just isolated incidents. They had reshaped the power structure of Liverpool's underworld. As law enforcement struggled to keep pace, the media intensified its coverage. Speculation, analysis, and sensational headlines fueled the public's fascination. Every minor act of violence was scrutinized, every rumor amplified, yet for all the attention, the core mystery remained unresolved. The original killer's identity, motives and methods remained shrouded in secrecy, and with each passing month, the city's sense of vulnerability deepened. Despite the chaos, one thing became unmistakably clear: the original murderer, or murderers, were operating with a level of expertise and patience that far exceeded ordinary criminals. The original 3 killings had set the stage for a prolonged period of uncertainty, a state in which fear and paranoia dictated the behavior of everyone involved. In Liverpool, the streets had become a stage for invisible forces, and the city's gangland learned a harsh lesson. In a world ruled by an unseen hand, survival depended on vigilance, caution, and the understanding that anyone could be next. As the months passed, the fear that gripped Liverpool's underworld began to evolve into something darker and more pervasive. The first 3 murders had already shattered the city's sense of criminal order. But now new acts of violence, while smaller and seemingly random, were becoming a psychological weapon. Fires consumed empty buildings that had once served as gang hangouts, and sporadic drive-by shootings left the streets littered with shattered glass and debris. These chaotic events did not match the precision of the initial killings, but they served a purpose: to keep everyone on edge. Each small attack whispered a warning that control was fragile and power could vanish in an instant. Amid the turmoil, detectives began to focus on the possibility of an organized campaign behind the murders. It was increasingly evident that the first 3 killings were not isolated incidents of personal revenge or street-level rivalry. The methodical nature of the attacks suggested a calculated strategy, one executed by someone with professional training. Police theorized that the killer had detailed knowledge of each victim's routines, a network of intelligence that extended beyond Liverpool itself. The killer did not merely strike, he studied, waited, and executed with meticulous timing, leaving no evidence behind. The breakthrough came in an unexpected form. A witness, low in the criminal hierarchy, came forward claiming to have seen a helmeted figure entering a warehouse after one of the murders. Police responded quickly, raiding the location. Inside, they found only traces of recent activity, faint footprints and soundproofed walls, suggesting a temporary base of operations. The space had clearly been abandoned before the raid, but the discovery confirmed what investigators had long suspected: the killer had used temporary hideouts, moving with a level of sophistication that suggested prior planning and foresight. It became clear that this was not the work of a local opportunist. Someone highly trained and methodical was orchestrating the terror. In the months that followed, yet another body emerged, this time in a deserted industrial estate on the outskirts of Liverpool. Unlike the previous murders, this killing was chaotic and personal. The victim, a known immerse tied to 2 of the earlier victims, had been tortured before death. The scene was messy, almost a deliberate statement. Detectives speculated that the killing was either an act of revenge by someone connected to the first victims, or a ploy intended to make the original murders appear unconnected. The contrast between this violent emotional act and the cold surgical nature of the earlier killings only deepened the mystery. It suggested a game being played on multiple levels, one in which fear and confusion were tools just as deadly as bullets. Meanwhile, the city's gangs struggled to adapt. Trust evaporated, replaced by suspicion and fear. Loyal associates vanished without explanation, and alliances that had once been stable began to crumble. Mid-level criminals refused to attend meetings, worried that any exposure could make them targets. Even those with reputations ruthlessness hesitated to act, unwilling to draw attention to themselves. The killings had fundamentally changed the dynamics of Liverpool's underworld, creating a climate in which survival depended more on caution than on strength or aggression. Law enforcement, for its part, was caught in a constant cycle of hope and frustration. Every lead seemed promising until it evaporated into nothing. Anonymous tips, second-hand sightings, and phone intercepts produced fragments of information, yet nothing concrete emerged. The complexity of the killer's methods made the investigation feel like chasing shadows. Every step forward revealed only how carefully orchestrated the crimes were. Analysts began to fear that traditional investigative techniques might never be enough. The psychological impact of the killings extended beyond the criminal networks. Residents, business owners, and ordinary citizens all felt the tension, even in areas not typically associated with gang activity. Streets that had once been familiar now felt threatening. Shopkeepers avoided eye contact with strangers, and parents warned their children to stay away from certain neighborhoods. Liverpool itself seemed to breathe uneasily, the sense of danger permeating even the most ordinary daily routines. By this point, a disturbing pattern had become evident. The first 3 murders had set a standard of fear, a template for terror that others seemed determined to emulate or challenge. The meticulous planning, precision execution, and invisibility of the original killer established an almost mythic presence. The subsequent murders and violent acts only reinforced the legend, creating a sense that the city itself had become a hunting ground for forces that could not be seen but were always present. Despite months of investigation, the identity of the original killer remained unknown. No arrests had been made, and no concrete motives had been established. Yet one undeniable truth emerged. The murders had permanently altered Liverpool's criminal handbook. Power shifted silently, fear dictated behavior, and the city's underworld learned a lesson in vulnerability that could not be unlearned. The shadow of the faceless assassin loomed over every alley, street, and backroom, leaving a chilling message that echoed through the city. In a world of unseen threats, survival required constant vigilance, and no one could ever be certain who would be next. By 2014, 2 years after the first wave of murders, Liverpool's underworld had been fundamentally altered. The city's criminal networks were fractured, alliances had dissolved, and fear dictated every decision. The original assassin's identity remained a mystery, and the chilling efficiency of the first 3 killings continued to haunt everyone with ties to organized crime. Even those who had survived the initial wave of violence were unwilling to risk exposure, opting instead to operate from the shadows or relocate entirely. Some gang leaders moved their operations abroad, while others relied on armed security or hired enforcers, knowing that the original killer's reach had proven unstoppable. Despite the heavy presence of law enforcement and intensive investigations, the murders remained unsolved. Detectives had chased leads across neighborhoods, warehouses, and abandoned industrial sites, following every fragment of intelligence. Anonymous tips, surveillance footage, and forensic evidence provided fleeting hope, only to dissolve into frustration. The weapon recovered from the Mersey River, linked to 2 of the murders, had yielded no fingerprints, and ballistics provided only partial answers. Investigators were confronted with the unsettling possibility that the original killer had planned every detail with such precision